Mignano, Italy, January 30th, 1944, 0827 hours. Obergefreiter Klaus Richter crouched inside Bunker 47, a reinforced concrete pillbox with walls 1.2 meters thick. The structure had been engineered by Organisation TOT, built to withstand anything the Allies could throw at it. Steel-reinforced concrete poured in layers, observation slits precisely calculated for maximum coverage while minimizing exposure. Richter and 12 other soldiers of the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division had occupied this position for 3 weeks. They had weathered daily bombardments from American 105mm and 155mm artillery. The bunker shook. Dust fell. Ears rang for hours afterward. But the walls held. Always the walls held. The Americans were predictable. Artillery preparation at dawn, infantry probes around noon, more shelling in the afternoon. Richter had developed a routine. When the shells started falling, you moved away from the walls, covered your ears, waited it out. Then you returned to your position and shot at the advancing Americans. Simple, survivable. That morning started differently. At 0827, Richter heard a sound unlike anything he'd ever experienced in 2 years of combat. Not the whistle of incoming shells or the shriek of Nebelwerfer rockets. This was deeper, a tearing sound as if the sky itself was being ripped open. Then the world exploded. The first 360-pound shell from Battery B, 697th Field Artillery Battalion, struck 80 meters from Bunker 47. The impact crater was 6 meters wide and 2 meters deep. The concussion wave travelled through the ground faster than sound through air. Inside the bunker, Richter was thrown against the wall. Light bulbs shattered. The cast iron stove in the corner toppled over. Before anyone could recover, the second shell hit. This one landed 30 meters away. The earth came through the walls. The concrete, which had never cracked under months of bombardment, began to spiderweb. Cracks appeared in the ceiling. One of the support columns, 40 centimeters of reinforced concrete, developed a split that ran from floor to ceiling. The third shell landed 20 meters from the bunker. The explosion was so powerful that it created a vacuum. Richter felt his eardrums flex inward, then outward. Blood ran from his nose. The soldier manning the MG-42 machine gun was lifted off his feet and slammed into the back wall. When Richter looked at the eastern wall, the one facing the American positions, he saw daylight. A crack 15 centimeters wide ran the height of the wall. Dust and smoke poured through it. For the first time since the bunker was built, the men inside could see outside without looking through the observation slits. The 240mm Howitzer M1, nicknamed the Black Dragon by American crews, had just announced its presence in the European theatre. What Richter couldn't know as he huddled in his disintegrating fortress, was that the gun firing at him represented a revolution in artillery warfare. The weapon was a monster. The barrel alone weighed 29,300 pounds. The entire system, when assembled and ready to fire, displaced over 64,000 pounds. To transport it, the gun had to be broken into 2 separate loads, the barrel and recoil mechanism on one trailer, the carriage on another. Each trailer rode on 6 wheels and required a tracked M33 prime mover, essentially a modified M3 Lee tank chassis, to move it. The crew needed over 2 hours to assemble the weapon for firing. They had to dig a recoil pit between the 2 large spade-shaped legs of the carriage to allow for the massive recoil at high angles. Once in place, the Black Dragon could hurl a 360-pound high explosive shell 23,066 meters. But it wasn't the range that terrified German soldiers. It was what happened when those shells arrived. The 240mm shell was not simply a larger version of conventional artillery ammunition. It was a bunker killer. The projectile contained 51 pounds of Composition B high explosive, specifically formulated for maximum blast effect. When fired with the concrete-piercing fuse, the shell was designed to penetrate hardened fortifications before detonating. Regular artillery shells, even 155mm rounds, exploded on the surface of concrete. They created impressive noise and flying debris, but against properly engineered fortifications, they were largely ineffective. Post-battle assessments conducted by 19th Corps engineers showed that it took 3 to 5 direct hits from a 155mm gun to penetrate a typical Siegfried Line pillbox. The 240mm howitzer required one hit. Often, it didn't even need to be direct. The concussion and ground shock alone could crack foundations, collapse support beams, and render defensive positions untenable. Hauptmann Wilhelm Schmidt commanded a company of the 89th Infantry Division defending positions south of Aachen in September 1944. His command post was a heavily fortified bunker that had been part of the original Siegfried Line construction in 1938. The bunker featured a reinforced concrete roof 2 meters thick, specifically designed to withstand aerial bombardment. Schmidt considered it invulnerable. He was wrong. On September 19, 1944, elements of the 2nd Armoured Division supported by the 272nd Field Artillery Battalion approached Schmidt's position. The Germans had expected the usual preliminary bombardment, which they would weather in their bunkers, followed by an infantry assault, which they would repel with interlocking machine gun fire. The attack followed a different pattern. At 1400 hours, American forward observers marked Schmidt's command bunker with smoke rounds. At 1407, the first 240mm shell landed 15 meters from the entrance. Schmidt was in the main chamber with his staff, studying maps by the light of petroleum lamps. The explosion was unlike anything they had experienced. The walls flexed. Concrete does not flex, but Schmidt watched it happen. The steel support beams bent like tree branches in wind. The petroleum lamps fell from the table. They were in complete darkness. Then the second shell hit. Schmidt's bunker didn't receive a direct hit. It didn't need to. The second shell impacted 12 meters from the rear of the structure. The explosive force transmitted through the earth, directly into the bunker's foundation. The floor buckled. The main support column cracked with a sound like a gunshot. Dust filled the air so thickly that the men couldn't see their hands in front of their faces. The third shell hit the slope above the bunker. Tons of earth were displaced. Crashing down on the roof, the ventilation shaft collapsed. Men began coughing immediately as the air turned foul. Schmidt ordered evacuation. His men, trained to hold their positions under any circumstances, fled into the open where American machine guns cut them down. The psychological impact of the 240mm howitzer transcended its physical destructive power. German soldiers had been conditioned throughout the war to trust their fortifications. The concrete bunkers represented safety, protection, survival. They were the one constant in a war where everything else was uncertain. When American super-heavy artillery shattered that certainty, it destroyed something more fundamental than concrete and steel. It destroyed confidence. Gefreiter Ernst Hartmann, 12th Volksgrenadier Division, described the experience in November 1944 near the Hürtgen Forest. The American guns are far away beyond our artillery range, beyond our ability to strike back. The sound is distinctive. You learn to recognize it. The whistle is deeper, lower pitched than regular shells. It sounds like freight trains falling from the sky. When you hear it, you know that whatever you're hiding behind, whatever hole you've dug, whatever structure you've taken shelter in, it doesn't matter. The shell will find you. The ground will betray you. The earth itself becomes the weapon. I've been in this war since 1940. I fought in France, in Russia, in Italy. I've never been more afraid than I am of those guns. You cannot see them. You cannot fight them. You can only wait for them to decide whether you live or die. The technical specifications of the Black Dragon were impressive, but the human element of its employment revealed something deeper about American military philosophy. Each 240mm howitzer battalion consisted of 3 firing batteries, each with 2 guns, for a total of 6 howitzers per battalion. The gun crew numbered 15 men. The battalion as a whole required over 500 soldiers, most of whom served in support roles, moving ammunition, maintaining the guns, conducting survey operations, managing logistics. This was not efficient by German standards. The Wehrmacht prided itself on doing more with less, on tactical brilliance compensating for material shortages. A German artillery battery operated with minimal support staff, maximum firepower from each gun, every man essential to the fighting. The American approach was different. Overwhelming logistics, redundant systems, unlimited ammunition. The 240mm howitzer embodied this philosophy perfectly. Each shell weighed 360 pounds. The weapon's maximum rate of fire was 1 round per minute, a rate no crew could sustain. Practical sustained fire was 30 shells per hour. Each battalion maintained ammunition stockpiles measured in hundreds of tons. During the Battle of Monte Cassino, the 697th Field Artillery Battalion alone fired over 800 rounds in the first week of February 1944. The shells were transported from ammunition dumps by dedicated truck companies, stockpiled near the gun positions, moved to the guns by tracked vehicles equipped with cranes. The entire operation required a logistics tale that would have bankrupted any European military. The Americans simply called it standard procedure. Oberst Franz Becker, Chief of Staff for the 81st Corps, reviewed intelligence reports on American artillery in December 1944. His assessment, captured in Corps records seized at war's end, reflected the growing desperation of German military thinking. The Americans have deployed 15 battalions of 240mm Howitzers onto the Western Front. Each battalion has 6 guns, 90 guns total. Each gun fires approximately 30 shells per hour during active operations. That represents 2,700 shells per hour across the entire front. Each shell weighs 163 kilograms and contains 23 kilograms of high explosive. Simple calculation reveals the Americans are delivering over 440,000 kilograms of ordnance per hour from these weapons alone. This does not include their 155mm guns, their 8-inch howitzers, their corps and divisional artillery, their mortars, their aerial bombardment. We have nothing comparable. Our heaviest mobile artillery is the 170mm gun, which fires a 68-kilogram shell. Our entire production of 170mm ammunition in 1944 was approximately 180,000 rounds. The Americans fire more 240mm shells in a single month than we produced 170mm shells in an entire year. This is not a war, it is industrial annihilation. Becker's analysis was accurate but incomplete. The true innovation of the 240mm howitzer was not the weapon itself, but the system that supported it. The M1 Black Dragon first saw combat at the Anzio beachhead in Italy in January 1944. The 697th and 698th Field Artillery Battalions deployed their guns in carefully prepared positions behind the Allied lines. The Germans, aware of the new weapons through intelligence reports and prisoner interrogations, initially dismissed them as curiosities. Large, unwieldy, requiring hours to emplace and displace, vulnerable to counter-battery fire. Generaloberst Eberhard von Mackensen, who assumed command of the newly formed 14th Army on January 25, 1944 to contain the beachhead, recorded his initial assessment after reviewing intelligence reports. The Americans have deployed super-heavy artillery at the beachhead. Our observers report weapons of 24cm caliber, possibly larger. These are siege guns, not battlefield weapons. Their emplacement time makes them vulnerable. Their limited mobility makes them targets. When we counterattack, they will be overrun. Von Mackensen was wrong on every count. The Black Dragons were positioned well behind the front lines, beyond the range of German artillery. American air superiority made German counter-battery fire nearly impossible. Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft that attempted to locate the guns were shot down. German artillery forward observers who tried to direct fire on American positions lasted hours before being neutralized by American counter-battery radar and overwhelming return fire. The American solution to the Black Dragon's mobility challenge revealed their approach to engineering problems. If the gun couldn't be moved quickly, make everything else move faster. The M33 prime mover could tow the barrel assembly at speeds up to 30 miles per hour on roads. The M35 prime mover, derived from the M10 tank destroyer, could manage rough terrain that would bog down wheeled vehicles. When roads were inadequate, American engineers built new ones. When bridges couldn't support the weight, American engineering battalions erected new bridges rated for 70 tons. The German assumption that the weapons were vulnerable because they were heavy ignored a fundamental reality. The Americans didn't adapt their tactics to their equipment. They adapted their logistics to make any tactic possible. At Anzio, the 240mm howitzers performed their first mission on January 24, 1944. The target was a German artillery position housing 170mm K-18 guns that had been shelling the beachhead from positions near Cisterna. German engineers had positioned the guns in reinforced revetments with overhead cover, protected by natural terrain features that made aerial attack difficult. The position had survived multiple bombing raids. At 15:30 hours, forward observers from the 697th Field Artillery Battalion radioed fire coordinates. At 15:37, the first 240mm shell landed 200 meters from the German position. Spotters called for adjustment. At 15:41, the second shell landed 50 meters short. At 15:44, the third shell scored a direct hit on the primary revetment. Lieutenant Otto Krebs survived the bombardment because he was in a communications bunker 150 meters from the gun position. The shell hit the revetment directly. The concrete roof, which was 1 meter thick and designed to withstand 500-pound bombs, simply ceased to exist. The explosion vaporized it. The gun beneath was lifted off its mounting and thrown 15 meters. The blast killed everyone within 50 meters instantly. Not wounded, not injured, killed. The overpressure alone was lethal. Men in the communications bunker bled from their ears and noses. When we emerged, the landscape had changed. Where there had been a fortified position, there was a crater 5 meters deep. The other guns in the battery, which were in separate revetments, were covered in debris and rendered inoperable. We received orders to evacuate the position immediately. No one argued. You cannot fight against weapons like that. You can only die. The 240mm howitzers continued firing throughout the Anzio campaign. German positions that had held for weeks fell in hours. Bridges collapsed under single hits. Observation posts that directed German artillery fire were demolished. The psychological effect rippled through German units. Soldiers began refusing to occupy bunkers, fearing they would become tombs. Junior officers struggled to maintain discipline as men abandoned positions at the first sound of incoming super-heavy shells. Generalfeldmarschall Albert Kesselring, commanding German forces in Italy, reported to Berlin in March 1944. American super-heavy artillery has fundamentally altered the tactical situation. Our defensive positions, which were constructed according to specifications that have served us well since 1940, are inadequate against 240mm shells. The Wehrmacht has no equivalent weapon. Our heaviest field artillery, the 170mm gun, lacks both the shell weight and explosive effect to neutralize American fortifications. We are outmatched in material. Kesselring's report triggered panic in German high command. If reinforced concrete bunkers, the cornerstone of German defensive doctrine, were vulnerable to American artillery, what could be held? The Siegfried Line, the ultimate expression of fortification engineering, consisted of over 18,000 bunkers, pillboxes and fighting positions. Concrete walls 2 meters thick, interlocking fields of fire. Underground command centers. Tank obstacles. Minefields. The defences had been designed to stop any attack. In September 1944 they would face the Black Dragon. The 265th to 278th, 538th, 539th, 551st, 552nd and 553rd Field Artillery Battalions, all equipped with 240mm howitzers, deployed along the Western Front. The 697th and 698th, veterans of Italy, joined them in November 1944. 15 battalions, 90 guns, thousands of tons of shells, the largest concentration of super-heavy artillery ever assembled. Feldwebel Kurt Schneider, 183rd Volksgrenadier Division, defended a section of the Siegfried Line near Aachen in October 1944. His position consisted of 4 interconnected bunkers with walls 1.5 meters thick, topped with an additional meter of earth and logs. The bunkers had survived air raids, tank fire, and 2 weeks of artillery bombardment. On October 14th, American forces began a systematic reduction of his sector. They started at dawn. The guns sounded different from the usual American artillery. The shells took longer to arrive, time enough to think, to pray, to wonder if this would be the one. The first shell landed in front of our position. The ground shook so violently that I thought an ammunition dump had exploded. The second shell hit Bunker 3. There were 6 men inside, experienced soldiers who had fought in Russia. The bunker was completely destroyed, not damaged, destroyed. Where there had been a concrete structure, there was rubble. We pulled 2 men from the debris. They were dead, crushed when the bunker collapsed. We couldn't find the others, buried under tons of concrete and earth. The Americans fired methodically, one shell every 2 minutes, always targeting our bunkers. By afternoon, Bunker 2 was gone. Bunker 4 was partially collapsed, unusable. We were ordered to hold, but holding what? Our fortifications were being erased. That night, what remained of the company withdrew. We abandoned positions that were supposed to be impregnable. We left our heavy weapons, our ammunition, everything. The technical challenge of firing the 240mm Howitzer was considerable. The gun crew had to survey the position precisely, calculate firing data accounting for weather, powder temperature, barrel wear, and projectile lot variation. The elevation mechanism required 2 men to operate. Loading the 360-pound shell required a dedicated ammunition crew using a hoist. The powder charge consisted of multiple bags that had to be loaded in the correct sequence. The gun had to be re-aimed after each shot due to recoil. Despite these challenges, well-trained American crews maintained fire rates that shocked German observers. During the battle for Aachen, the 272nd Field Artillery Battalion fired 216 rounds in a single day, October 15, 1944. That represented 77,760 pounds of high explosive delivered on German positions. Each shell was hand-loaded, hand-fused, and individually fired. The crews worked in continuous rotation, men taking breaks to rest their muscles while others maintained the firing rate. When barrels overheated, they were allowed to cool while sister batteries continued firing. The Germans had never seen artillery employed with such intensity. Wehrmacht doctrine called for conserving ammunition, firing only when targets were identified, limiting sustained bombardments to preserve barrel life and ammunition stocks. The Americans operated under different assumptions. Ammunition was unlimited, barrels could be replaced. The only constraint was how fast crews could work. Hauptmann Josef Dietz, operations officer for the 9th Panzer Division, observed American artillery operations through captured documents and prisoner interrogations. His after-action report from November 1944 captured the growing sense of futility. American artillery doctrine is fundamentally different from ours. We fire at targets. They fire at map coordinates, we conserve ammunition, they expend it freely. We have artillery officers calculating the minimum rounds needed to achieve effect. They fire until nothing remains. One prisoner, a forward observer for their 240mm battalion, stated they were assigned a grid square 500 meters by 500 meters and told to destroy everything in it. Not to suppress, not to neutralize, to destroy. They fired 76 rounds into that square, 27,360 kilograms of explosive. They reduced an entire defensive position to a moonscape. Then they repeated the process with the next grid square. This is not artillery as we understand it. This is industrial demolition applied to warfare. We cannot compete with this. We don't have the shells. We don't have the barrels. We don't have the trucks to move that much ammunition. We don't have the factories to produce it. Even if we captured their guns, we couldn't employ them as they do. We lack the entire system that makes such employment possible. The ammunition supply chain for the 240mm Howitzer represented logistics at a scale that defied German comprehension. Each shell left American factories on the East Coast, was transported by rail to ports, loaded onto ships, crossed the Atlantic in convoy, was unloaded at French ports, moved by truck or rail to ammunition depots, stored in weatherproof bunkers, requisitioned by artillery battalions, transported forward by dedicated ammunition trucks, transferred to the gun position by tracked vehicles, and finally loaded and fired. The entire journey might take 8 weeks from factory to impact. The system moved thousands of shells monthly without interruption. Wehrmacht logistics officers who examined captured American supply documentation in late 1944 compiled assessments that circulated through the German High Command. One such report, prepared by the Quartermaster Staff of Army Group G in November 1944, detailed the stark reality. The Americans maintain 15 240mm Howitzer battalions on the Western Front. Each battalion fires an average of 600 rounds per month, 9,000 rounds monthly. Each round weighs 163 kilograms, 1,467,000 kilograms of ammunition. This does not include the powder charges, the fuses, the packing materials, the transportation costs. To supply these 15 battalions requires approximately 500 truck trips per month, or 17 per day. The Americans performed this task routinely while simultaneously supplying their divisions, core artillery, air forces, and maintaining strategic reserves. Our entire ammunition production for all calibers in November 1944 totaled approximately 2,400,000 kilograms. The Americans expend more than half that amount from 15 artillery battalions alone in a single month. They produce ammunition faster than we can fire it. They transport supplies faster than we can intercept them. They replace losses faster than we can inflict them. This is not a war of soldiers, it is a war of factories, and we lost that war in 1941 when America entered the conflict. By December 1944, German defensive doctrine had devolved to account for American super-heavy artillery. Bunkers were abandoned in favour of dispersed field fortifications. Command posts were moved frequently. Ammunition was never concentrated. These adaptations reduced casualties but also reduced combat effectiveness. Dispersed positions couldn't generate the concentrated firepower that bunkers provided. Mobile command posts struggled to maintain communications. Distributed ammunition stocks slowed resupply. The 240mm Howitzer had accomplished its mission without destroying the German army. It had forced the Germans to abandon the defensive advantages that might have prolonged the war. General der Panzertrooper Hermann Balck, commanding the 6th Army in Hungary, wrote in his private journal in January 1945, an entry discovered in his papers after the war. "We have learned to fear the American artillery more than their tanks, more than their aircraft, more than their infantry. The 240mm howitzers especially. They fire from positions we cannot reach. They destroy fortifications that took months to build. They are wasteful, inefficient, excessive by our standards. But they are effective. That is what matters in war, not efficiency, effectiveness. The Americans have chosen to be effective through material superiority. They can afford to be wasteful because they have so much to waste. We cannot afford anything. Every shell must count. Every position must be held. Every soldier must fight to the last. Meanwhile, they fire 360-pound shells at isolated bunkers because they can. Because the shells are available, because replacement barrels are in the supply depot, because trucks are waiting to bring more ammunition forward. We speak of German military virtues, of tactical skill compensating for material inferiority. These virtues are real, but they are not enough. You cannot outthink industrial capacity. You cannot outmaneuver production numbers. You cannot substitute courage for concrete-piercing shells. The 240mm howitzer remained in action through the final months of the war in Europe. The weapons participated in the reduction of the Colmar pocket in January 1945, the crossing of the Rhine in March, the reduction of the Ruhr pocket in April. Wherever German forces attempted to establish fortified positions, the Black Dragons appeared. Their presence alone was often sufficient to force German withdrawals. Intelligence reports spoke of the guns with mythic dread. The psychological campaign was so effective that some German units surrendered rather than face bombardment by weapons they had learned to fear. Major Wilhelm Hoffmann, captured near Cologne in March 1945, provided testimony to American interrogators that was recorded in the National Archives. "When we saw your 240mm howitzers in Italy, we thought they were an aberration. Siege guns improperly used in mobile warfare. When they appeared on the Siegfried Line, we realized our mistake. You didn't adapt the guns to your doctrine. You adapted everything else to make the guns effective. You built roads where there were none. You moved supplies that we thought impossible to move. You fired ammunition at rates we considered unsustainable. You did this while fighting us and fighting Japan simultaneously. The gun itself is impressive, but it is not the gun that defeated us. It is everything behind the gun. The factories, the ships, the trucks, the training, the resources, the systematic application of industrial power to military problems. We built concrete fortresses and thought ourselves safe. You built a machine that produced and delivered steel shells faster than we could pour concrete. That is the difference between our nations, between our war efforts, between our outcomes. You did not defeat us with better soldiers or better tactics. You buried us under an avalanche of material we could not match, could not counter, could not survive. The howitzers were simply the most visible symbol of this reality. When we heard them fire, we knew the battle was already lost. In 1953, 12 240mm howitzers were brought out of storage and deployed to Korea. The 213th, and 159th Field Artillery Battalions employed them against Chinese and North Korean bunkers that smaller artillery could not destroy. On May 1st, 1953, the first round fired by Baker Battery of the 213th Field Artillery Battalion struck an ammunition dump on a hill designated the Donut by aerial observers. The resulting secondary explosion blew the top off the hill. The Chinese fortifications, which had resisted months of bombardment, were neutralized. Between May 1st and the armistice on July 27, 1953, the two battalions fired 5,043 rounds. Each shell was 45 years old, designed and manufactured during World War II, stored in depots and transported halfway around the world to fight a different war. They remained effective. The 240mm Howitzer was retired from American service in the late 1950s when ammunition stocks were finally exhausted. The legacy of the Black Dragon demonstrated that in modern industrial warfare, the advantage lies not with the side that has the best soldiers or the most brilliant tactics, but with the side that can produce and supply weapons faster than the enemy can build defences. The Germans learned this lesson in bunkers across Italy, France and Germany. They learned it when concrete walls that should have been impenetrable cracked and collapsed. They learned it when fortifications that represented months of labour were reduced to rubble in minutes. They learned it in the sound of shells falling from the sky, deep-throated and implacable, the mechanical thunder of American industry transformed into explosive force. General George S. Patton reportedly said, "Fixed fortifications are monuments to man's stupidity." The Germans built monuments, the Americans built howitzers. In the end, the difference between monuments and victory was measured in 360-pound increments.